friends, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. I've learned a new word this morning. It's anti-feminist. And it's a great word. I'm going to use that word in my writings and speaking. Now, guess what has been the best insult I received over the last year, I think. Yes, I have been called a misogynist. But can you guess the best insult I've had? Christian. There's one that tops that. £25 for the winner. Anti-Christian. Racer, you're getting close, but I'll better. Alt-right, they've come very close to that, but there's something that tops it. Yes, you're right. Give him a hand. I've been called a white supremacist, and people repeatedly on Twitter, particularly the feminist gang, ask me to check my male white privilege. And my response to them is, hey, I was born in India, grew up in India, and my skin is browner than burnt toast. and you need to go to Specsavers. Believe me, I never hear from them after that, which just goes to show you that this whole racist, bigot, homophobic, Islamophobic, and when someone calls me that, I say, I'll solve your problem. Just call me Sixherb, SIXHIRB, and the full form of Sixherb is sexist, intolerant, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, racist, bigot. Now, last year I had the unique privilege of being blocked for a conference. I was asked to speak at a conference at Church House, the headquarters of the Church of England, and this conference was called Rebuilding Bridges. It was a conference intended to rehabilitate Bishop George Bell. Bishop George Bell, as you know, was one of the few bishops who took a stand against Hitler when others were trying to appease him. And Bishop George Bell, 50 years after his death, was accused of molesting a young girl with not a shred of evidence against him. The great and good of the country protested, stood by Bishop George Bell. His name was defaced from schools, all the buildings that had been named after him. Eminent historians and journalists, people like Peter Hitchens, who's written again today in defense of him, by the way, stood for Bishop George Bell. I took a stand by writing a number of columns in favor of Bishop George Bell. But the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of York, the entire cohort who are scared to death of the feminists, or rather, let me modify that, who have completely bought into the progressive feminist ideology, refused to even apologize, despite the fact that no charges were no evidence was ever found against him. I was asked to speak at a conference, and the Bishop of Gloucester, Rachel Treweek, and the Bishop of Newcastle, Christine Hartman, both went public, went to the media and said that I should be banned, deplatformed, because I am a misogynist. And guess what made me a misogynist? I'd written a satirical piece and I had called women bishops bishopettes. That made me a misogynist. Now, I love history, and I love the history of the Second World War, and I love this particular incident. On the night of May the 16th, 1943, 19 Lancaster bombers took off from RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. Each bomber was strapped with a 9,000-pound bomb. And the mission of the 617th Squadron, codename Operation Chastise, Chastise, I think it's pronounced chastise, not chastise, was to destroy the German dams in the Ruhr Valley. Time magazine, in a feature story titled Why the World War II Dam Busters Mission Was So Important, called Operation Chastise one of the most daring and profitable exploits of the air war against Germany. The dams were towering symbols of German identity and engineering. The dams were the lifeblood of the Third Reich's industrial heartland. If the Allies could blow up the dams, the titanic power of the flooding water would do the rest. The pent-up water would unleash unimaginable chaos and destruction. It would shatter the barricades that had thus far constrained the dormant fury of the waters. It would convert the restrained waters thus far channeled by the dams to agriculture, electricity, and to homes. It would convert this power into a malignant and merciless force that was now uncontrollable, destructive, and deadly. The lawless and violent waters of biblical proportions obliterated entire townships of workers' homes, rendering them completely uninhabitable. It razed massive heavy industry establishments and power stations to the ground, ripped out countless telephone and power lines, and wiped out road and railway lines. The industrial region around the Ruhr Valley was almost irreparably damaged. A decade later, as you know, Operation Chastise was turned into a movie called The Dam Busters, one of my favorite movies. Now, what do the Dam Busters have to do with the feminist destruction of the Church of England? Dams, as we all know, are enormous concrete or masonry structures set on broad bases with high walls. They are almost invulnerable to direct hits from bombs or the effect of shock waves. A British inventor by the name of Barnes Wallis finally figured out how to breach the dams. It would require a 6,500-pound high explosive to be detonated against the inner wall of the dam. Inner wall. The explosive charge would have to be placed against the dam wall. Wallace concluded that when the charge was detonated, the resulting shock waves could crack open the structure and allow the massive back pressure of millions of gallons of water to finish the job. You can tease out this analogy to the feminist destruction, not only of the Church of England, but of almost every single Christian denomination and of society itself in your own mind, because I've chosen this description very carefully. If human life and human potential is to flourish, dams have to be erected and defended. Now, the building of dams or barriers or barricades or distinctions or separations is one of the most important acts of creation writ large on the first page in the first story of the first book of the Bible. It is presented as humanity's first story. It is archetypal. Now, friends, you don't have to be a biblical scholar or a Jew or a Christian or even a person of faith to benefit from a biblical story. You can treat it as an archetypal or a mythical narrative. Jordan Peterson uses this methodology in his lectures on the Bible and in his book 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. People inhabit certain universal stories, and these universal archetypal stories provide the scaffolding of structure and meaning to individuals and to society. Archetypal narratives also transmit collective wisdom and woe betide to the individual or the society that rejects that collective wisdom. Now, most biblical scholars have shown that the first creation story in the book of Genesis, there are two creation stories, is a polemic, an attack against an ancient Babylonian creation story called the Enuma Elish. Many scholars also believe that the biblical flood story in Genesis chapter 6 is the product of a polemic, an attack against another archetypal flood story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The tablets are there in the British Museum, I believe. And these stories of the flood were common in the ancient world. Again, you don't have to be a biblical scholar or a Jew or a Christian to benefit from the truths of the story. If you delight in the glories of Western civilization, its music, art, architecture, literature, science, and philosophy, you will concede that what gave birth to Europe and to the West was a meta-narrative rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in Greco-Roman civilization, and in the Christian Reformation and secular Enlightenment. Now, this meta-narrative has been fiercely contested, resisted, and rejected by postmodernism and cultural Marxism. Postmodernism and cultural Marxism recognize that in the Judeo-Christian Western tradition, there were a number of dams resisting chaos and holding Western civilization in place. And one of the biggest and most important of these dams, dare I say the biggest, has been the distinction between male and female, man and woman. A distinction that is inextricably intertwined with the biblical narrative of creation. Feminists in the Church of England and in other Christian denominations blew this dam to smithereens. I must confess that I was part of this operation, and I considered myself to be a feminist until the dam was blown up and I saw the catastrophic destruction. But then it was too late, and I stand repentant. Part of coming to this conference is my process of atonement, I guess. Now, if you want to rise from barbarism to civilization, you need to build dams. Dams give rise to civilization. Marriage and the restraining of sexual desire is one such dam. In 1935, Oxford anthropologist Joseph Unwin tried to prove that he was a kind of proto-feminist, if I can call him that. He tried to prove that marriage was an irrelevant institution and the dam of sexual restraint could be blown up without any major blowback. Joseph Unwin studied 86 different cultures to prove his point. His research led him to conclude precisely the opposite. You can download his book from the internet. It's yellowed now, but I was first introduced to this book when I was chaplain to the Old Royal Naval Chapel, and a senior member of the RBS fraud team came up to me and said, "You need to read this. And I would like to print this and send it to every member of Parliament. This is hardcore research." And Joseph Unwin says this, he writes this in his book. He says, any human society is free to choose either to display great energy or to enjoy unrestrained sexual freedom. The evidence, he says, is that it cannot do both for more than one generation. Unwin had no Christian connections and applied no moral judgment. He says, I offer no opinion about rightness or wrongness. Don't ever take a fence down until you know why it was put up in the first place, quipped the great English writer G.K. Chesterton. But what if taking the fence down or blowing the dam up was a deliberate decision, engineered precisely to destroy church, society, and nation? What if the most basic, primordial, and fundamental distinction, or the most monumental dam, if you want to call it that, is the distinction between male and female, man and woman, that feminists had to blow up in order to achieve their goal of an egalitarian utopia, dystopia we would call it that, their goal of dethroning the patriarchy and enthroning matriarchy in its place. I've said it, dams are the most basic, primordial, and fundamental distinctions in creation. They create order and restrain chaos, another great term used by Jordan Peterson. And God creates these dams in the archetypal story of creation. Again, take it as an archetypal story. Dams are God's signature tune in that story of creation. And I'll never forget it because I've studied Hebrew. And as I was reading the text, there was one word that was not a common word in Hebrew, and the grammar was different, and that was the word God divided or separated. And very quickly, you probably know this, the first story. In the first creation story, on the very first day, God creates a distinction separating light from darkness. On the second day, God creates a firmament separating the waters above from the waters beneath. On the third day, God separates waters from land to create sea and earth. On the fourth day, God creates sun and moon to separate day and night. On the sixth day, God creates two separations. He separates human beings from animals because he creates human beings in his own image and likeness. And he separates male from female. God blesses these distinctions and calls them good, nay, very good. Dams and distinctions are good. Sin in the biblical conceptual world enters when these dams are breached and destroyed, when separations are spurned, and chaos results when dams are destroyed. So, the Bible makes distinctions between good and evil, light and darkness, day and night, land and sea, lawful and forbidden, human beings and animals, holy and profane, but the most fundamental distinction among human beings is the distinction between male and female, man and woman. Now, every time a distinction is violated, a dam is blown up, chaos ensues. God makes a distinction between permitted fruit, extravagantly permitted fruit. You can eat any fruit from any tree in the garden. And he makes a distinction between that and the fruit of one tree, but not that tree. And the first woman, the first feminist in a sense, Eve, violates that distinction. I mean, she tells God to go to hell. And did God really say? The battle against language, which the feminists have used to their own benefit greatly, begins there. And if feminists ever tell you about the hegemony of male patriarchy, point them to the first archetypal story. Eve not only tells God to go and get lost, but also lures her husband into eating the forbidden fruit, and he suffers as a result of that. It's very interesting. By the way, I've been trying to think of a column I intend to write about men who are constantly falsely accused, the whole rape culture thing. And again, if you look at a number of archetypal stories in Genesis, we don't even need to go to the book of Kings where you have Jezebel there. You have the Potiphar's wife who wants to have sex with Joseph when he is first imprisoned in Egypt and then raised to be Pharaoh's right-hand man. And when he refuses to have sex with her, she screams, pounces on him, he leaves his garment there, and she accuses him of trying to rape her, and Joseph is thrown into prison for a very long time as a result of that false accusation. Jordan Peterson is right, by the way. He's opened a completely new world for me in terms of my own biblical studies. These archetypal stories are there for all of us and have lessons for society and for us to learn. Cain kills his brother in the next story, violating the distinction between human and animal, just as Abel had killed a sacrificial animal. And this violation of distinction peaks in a bizarre story in the early chapters of Genesis. And I want you to note this. When we are told, we don't know what precisely this means, but we are told that the sons of God have sexual intercourse with the daughters of man, thus violating the distinction between the divine and the human. Now, when this dam is breached, Noah's flood occurs and is catastrophic in its destruction. And then later on, again, the distinction between male and female is violated in the homosexual rape or attempted rape of these men in Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. Now, this distinction between man and woman is so significant that the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, even has a law that prohibits cross-dressing. What I'm trying to get across to you is that there are distinctions. This is one of the great truths of the stories of the Bible. There are no distinctions. That is one of the great lies of feminism, and it is the dam feminism had to breach in order to achieve its goals. Professor Mary Cassian, who's written a number of books on feminism and the church, uses the metaphor of a tsunami to refer to the destruction wrought by feminism. In her book, The Feminist Mistake, the radical impact, yes, she's punning on Betty Friedan's, in fact, the cover page has the feminine mystique, and there is a cancellation mark there, and it says the feminist mistake. Feminist mistake, the radical impact of feminism on church and culture, she outlines the wreckage feminism has left behind. The dam blew up. The waters have done the job. She says the divorce rate has increased more than 100%. Cohabitation has increased 1,000%. One American child is born outside of marriage every 25 seconds. Only 45% of all teenage children live with their married biological father and mother. She said, I could cite many more statistics about the dramatic increases in abortion, homosexuality, the abuse of women and children, pornography, violence, sexual perversion, and sexually transmitted disease. Never before, she says, has mankind faced such a rapid and widespread disintegration of morality and concurrent increase in gender confusion and conflict. Close quote. The ultimate ideological goal of third-wave feminism was not the equality of men and women. It was the complete overthrow of the God of the Bible and the destruction of the traditional family. Mary Cassian, I quote her again, she says, feminism began with the deconstruction of a Judeo-Christian view of womanhood. That is, the right to name self, progressed to the destruction of manhood, gender relationships, family, societal structures, and a Judeo-Christian worldview. That is, the right to name the world, and concluded with the concept of metaphysical pluralism, self-deification, and the rejection of the Judeo-Christian deity, the right to name God. Sociologist Gabriele Kubi, a German sociologist, by the way, most of her writing is in German. She's excellent. A convert from atheism to Catholicism, echoes this goal. She writes, feminism hadn't been about equal rights for a long time. The goal was renunciation of heterosexuality and the destruction of the family and the church, social structures that cannot exist without the union of man and woman in marriage. Now, the bouncing bomb that the Christian feminists would use to breach this dam of male-female distinction in the Church of England and most other denominations, that bomb was the ordination of women. We are familiar with the endless political and ideological battles in General Synod, the decision-making body of the Church of England, where this battle was primarily fought and won. However, it is vital to note that the feminist battle transcends denominations. I taught at the London School of Theology, a supposedly, allegedly, evangelical theological college, and my vice principal, the person who appointed me, was from Canada, and a wonderful person. I got on extremely well with her, but she was a hardcore feminist. And feminism at this theological college was where most students were not from the Church of England, but from smaller, more conservative evangelical denominations, was rammed down the throats of young men and women who came really to study for the ministry rather than to be ideologically indoctrinated. So feminism has had its tentacles in every single major Protestant denomination, including conservative groupings like the Baptists. Only the dams of Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy remain standing. However, that's true just of the ordination of women. Within the Roman Catholic Church, radical feminists continue to fight this battle, and the present Pope is very much on the left, very much feminist, progressive, Marxist. Now, part of the reason the Church of England surrendered so rapidly to the onslaught of feminism was its leanings towards socialism and the left-wing ideology of egalitarianism, which Justin Welby and John Sentamu, Archbishops of York and Canterbury, spout almost every week in the media. Anglican feminists accepted both the basis and the strategy proposed by Simone de Beauvoir in her book The Second Sex, where she declared that women needed to identify themselves as a group and collectively declare war on men. Equality would be achieved only by destroying men's superiority and by refusing to succumb to a traditional role. And in this case, it would mean elevating women to the priesthood and to the episcopate, making them priests and bishops. The primary argument of Christian feminists was that women should be allowed to do everything that men could do, and in the same manner and with the same recognized status as men. I remember a young black woman who had gone to a women's conference, a Christian Anglican women's conference, and she came back with a look of horror on her face. And I said, "What's happened?" She said, this was the new cohort of women who had just been ordained. And as you know, in Christian ministry, the priesthood or a calling to be a pastor is a calling that comes from God, and you do it to serve him and others. And I said, what were these women saying? And apparently the reason why these women, they were telling a big group, the reason why these women were ordained as priests in the Church of England, some would call them priestesses, but never mind, they don't like to be called that, was because they wanted to hear what it sounded like when a woman's voice resonated in a church building, holding up the Eucharist and saying, "This is my body, this is my blood." That was the kind of feminism that was coming across in the Church of England. The women decided to seek equality in the church by pursuing women's ordination. Now, all denominations followed a particular strategy for role equality, and these were the 6 steps all feminists in Christian churches followed. First, feminists argued that men had written and interpreted the Bible for centuries, and from the time of the early church fathers, the first 3 or 4 centuries, it had been interpreted from a patriarchal perspective. By the way, I taught this nonsense, right? I taught it with passionate intensity and vigor. So I know exactly what I'm talking about. Therefore, it was necessary to deconstruct this patriarchal interpretation by replacing it with a hermeneutic of suspicion, big buzzword in feminist scholarship. And this hermeneutic of suspicion was a reading of the biblical text that would be alert to feminist concerns and would regard the biblical text not as the Word of God, but as a human construct that was the product of men who were tainted by their patriarchal prejudices. A feminist analysis would reread the texts to expose the androcentric bias and to demonstrate how women had been misrepresented. Second, it was necessary, now this sounds contradictory, but there you are. Second, it was necessary to affirm that the Bible, properly read, of course by feminists, affirmed the full worth and equality of women. There was never any doubt about this. Never. Which is why the Bible was the most liberating text in the ancient world and continues to be so in societies like India and Africa. And the Bible portrays men and women as ontologically equal in creation, both created in the image and likeness of God. Profoundly radical statement to make, but functionally different. Men and women are equal but complementary in the different roles God gives to us. The feminist gospel deliberately confused ontological equality with functional distinctiveness. Third, it was necessary to deconstruct the most central doctrines of Christianity, i.e., sin and salvation. The human problem, according to the Christian gospel, is sin and fallenness. The human problem, according to the feminist gospel, is patriarchy. The solution, according to the Christian gospel, is from God alone. We cannot save ourselves. We are saved by grace through faith in Christ. The solution, according to the feminist gospel, is from women alone. Women are not sinners, but sinned against. Women must save themselves by revolting against the rules of the game to restructure professions, marriage, family, and the home. The gospel, the Christian gospel, portrays Jesus as the victim who died for our sins and paid the penalty for sin on the cross. The feminist gospel portrays women as the victims who are crucified at the hands of men and pay the penalty for being born with a womb that can bring new life into the world. Fourth, it was necessary to alter the very language of biblical translations and to replace traditional translation like the Revised Standard Version with a non-sexist and inclusive language translation like the New Revised Standard Version. So, for example, this new translation, instead of the patriarchal kingdom of God, it has become the dominion of God. Lord and King have given way to ruler and sovereign. God our Father becomes God our Father, Mother. The translation, by the way, goes to great lengths to avoid offending anyone except perhaps God himself. Darkness, due to its racist overtones, is no longer equated with evil. References to the right hand of God are eliminated so as not to offend left-handed people. References to blind, deaf, or lame, Jesus healed all of them, have been edited to make them more sensitive, and accusations slaves become enslaved people, parents guide, not discipline their children, who in turn are told to heed, not obey their parents. Master becomes teacher, and the doubly offensive Son of Man, Jesus is called the Son of Man, direct translation from the Aramaic, becomes the human one. I mean, it's wonderful. The Wall Street Journal caustically remarked, "It's pretty pathetic to watch theologians waste their time worrying that a left-handed blind woman might somehow think that the Bible excludes her, where the main message of the text teaches exactly the opposite. Apparently, the contemporary equivalent of pondering how many angels can fit on the head of the pin is to calculate the number of gender-offensive words in the Bible." Fifth, it was necessary to deconstruct the very being of God, so that metaphors like the Father of God and the manhood of Jesus, upon which the male priesthood was predicated, would no longer hold sway in the theology of the church. So feminists began to talk about God as mother and Jesus as an androgynous being that contained within himself, herself, both male and female. I taught at a very liberal seminary in India where we were compelled to recite the Lord's Prayer, not by saying, "Our Father who art in heaven," but "Our Parent who art in heaven." Since God is male, the male is God. Mary Daly said this, and so we cannot have God as male any longer. Sixthly, and finally, feminists won the battle for ordination to the priesthood and the episcopate, 2014. 16 women have been since consecrated bishops. The results were catastrophic, and my time is running out, but I'll just say that for 4,000 years, the Bible assigned roles to men as priests and pastors in the tabernacle, temple, synagogue, and church. Priestesses were found only in pagan religions and associated with fertility cults, the cult of Baal. The false gospel of feminism must be named for what it is, a pagan gospel and a pagan religion. Feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther openly admits that she has more devotion to pagan female deities like Isis, Athena, and Artemis than to the Virgin Mary. The dam has been breached with catastrophic consequences. The most radical of this is the complete denial of any biological basis for gender, and the Church of England is now on a drive to recruit transgender clergy and to introduce baptismal-like initiation rites for transgender people. I'd like to end with a picture. This provocative painting is featured on the cover of a book. I tried to get an image of this, but it's so offensive that most publishers won't even put it online on the book. Imagine this picture in your mind. It's a cover page of the book titled Sex and God, Some Varieties of Women's Religious Experience by Linda Hercombe. Let me describe the image for you. It is you know about the Holy Trinity in Christianity. Now look at this image. This is the figure of a squatting human with a flowing triangular beard and a drooping belly, sagging breasts, and 4 curvy hands. On this creature's head is another human, it's just a face, perched amidst matted locks of hair, and between its legs juts out yet another human face, surrounded by what could be taken as the main figure's pubic hair. An explanatory comment inside the cover reads that the figure visualizes the bodily birth, God as mother of the entire fabric of creation, and the mental birth, God as father of the creative mind which must be spoken for ideas to be born. Orthodox Christians may find the picture to be blasphemous, but more and more women in the church are being drawn to such images of God in place of the traditional fatherly or perhaps even grandfatherly image imagined in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Operation Feminist Chastise has succeeded. The dam busters have won. The floodwaters have destroyed everything in its wake. We are left lamenting, singing in the ruins, and singing the Lord's song in a strange land. Thank you.
I have a question. So I don't feel as strongly about female ministers. I go to church every Sunday. We do have a female minister. And partially I agree with you. What I see, I'm the only man going to church on Sunday. It's a very small congregation. We are usually 7, 8 women and me. Sometimes there's 1 or 2 tourists, male tourists, walking in. And our minister, she is doing like a lecture or something in the congregation, strong women in the Bible. And I was wondering, it seems like women still feel connected to Christianity, where I see that men seem to be dropping out. Is that just in our congregation, or is that a phenomenon in the Christian church?
So that has been a problem in the Christian church for the last 40 years, I think. And part of the reason, sociologists say, has to do with the feminization of the church. Now, I empathize, not just sympathize with what you've just said, because I not only saw no problem with female priests, there are wonderful, strong women in the Bible, and I could rattle off their names, starting with, Rahab the prostitute. I love these women to bits. I admire them. Ruth, Esther, my goodness, I can go on and on and on. Women have a tremendous and great ministry, but that's complementary to men. Women were prophetesses in the Old Testament. So the church has never denied women a place for ministry. What women were fighting for was the priesthood, which was exactly the same thing that men had. But we can talk more about that. Your other question, my other response is, it's been argued for a long time that increasing feminization of the church has excluded men. So, for example, when I was at the London School of Theology, there was a guy who was in prison, really solid guy with tattoos and all that sort of thing. And he came up to me and he said, I'm sick of what's happening here, because I want to hear a robust, strong Christianity. And what I'm getting is the sissification of the Bible. The Bible is a text for men, to be strong and bold and masculine, etc., etc. And this is what men in the would like to hear, because I want to bring them out of the lifestyle they've been in. But if I present them with what I'm being taught here, they're going to be completely put off by it. And in my own experience, the more women have been elevated to the priesthood and the episcopate, what we're hearing is this kind of, feelings-based theology where you come to church, you hold a pebble in your hand and you put your hand in water and look at a candle and feel. And the intellectual rigor, the meat of biblical teaching or theology, and serious what I call cultural exegesis has been completely thrown overboard. Jesus, for example, his parables, he's saying that like a mother hen gathers. Now I've taught all this, and I can look at the feminine in the Bible till both of us are blue in the face. So that's not a problem at all. What was I going to say here? The central word, if there is one word about Christianity, just one word, it's not peace, it's not love, it's grace. And grace is God's unmerited favor towards all of us who have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And my father, for example, who was a strong man, never understood this word grace. So, for example, when he heard the story of the prodigal son, he said, if you had asked me for my wealth, and if you slammed the door in my face and walked away, and you came back sorrowful and repentant, I would slam the door in your face. And he always told me growing up, deserve and then desire. I'm not going to get you a gift for your birthday or anything. I always wanted guns, by the way. Unless you earn it. Now, you're right. The feminine would come in and say, no, let's be gracious. Let's give it to Jules because he's our son. So grace covers everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Jules. Ladies and gentlemen, Jules Gomes.
Thank you.